Good afternoon. Welcome to our second conversation here for the afternoon. The central theme of this conversation is the current new forms of populism in conjunction with religion and or resistance. We will hear more about this within the nation forum. And I guess at the heart of this conversation lies the question whether, with the current rise of populist movements, we are witnessing an entirely new phenomenon or merely an amplification of old modes of exclusion and inclusion. Before we start, just let me briefly introduce you the three discussants. Niloufar Göle's work centers on Islamic visibility in European public spaces and the debates it endangers on religious and cultural difference. Among her latest publication is The Daily Life of Muslims, in which she offers a perspective on Muslim life in Europe that challenges the narratives of extremism and disintegration. Ranapi Samadia has researched and written on migration and refugee studies, the theory and practices of dialogue, nationalism and post-colonial statehood in South Asia, and new regimes of technological restructuring and labor control. In his latest book, A Post-Colonial Inquiry into Europe's Debt and Migration Crisis, he states that Europe's present crisis suggests a post-colonial bind, or even a post-colonial destiny of Europe. And Petar Bojanic's expertise is located in the area of political philosophy, social ontology, and Jewish political thought. In his recent publication, Violence and Messianism, he looks at how some of the protagonists of the so-called Renaissance of Jewish philosophy between the two world wars grappled with problems of violence, revolution, and war. Petar Bojanić, he will open the conversation with an introduction that situates the conjunction of populism, religion, and the nation forum. And they decided to organize the conversation in the following way. They keep it for 45 minutes in between the three, and then the floor is open for you to pose your questions. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to converse with us together this topic.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, we have now here moderator, and I will follow instructions of the organizer to talk a little bit on ex-Yugoslavia, and I had the liberty to talk a little bit of this phrase or syntagma, practice of theory, as an introduction of these panels, we can say, or sessions. But before that, I would like to thank Catherine and Manuela, as well as Orlike, Leona, Niklas, and the others. And also, I'd like to mention also in those invisible workers here, translators behind us, for their kind hospitality. Allow me to read my introduction to this session for it to go quicker and smoother. First, a few words regarding the phrase, quote-unquote, practice of theory that appears nowhere in Balibar and Wallerstein's book. Here is what Manuela and Catherine Klingen write in the argument of this project. I quote, "The organizers of the seminars," that means organized by philosopher Etienne Balibar and historian and sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein, held 3 consecutive years in the 80s, spoke of practice of theory, which was understood as continuous engagement or dialogue between positions and was evoked through the common clarification of questions and conceptions in a reciprocal process of cognition. End of quote. And in Sur la dialectique matérialiste, the l'inégalité des origines, which will later appear in the book Pour Marx from 1963, Althusser uses 2 similar formulations. First, la pratique théorique marxiste, that means Marxist theoretical practice, and une pratique de la théorie, a practice of theory. Althusser writes, I quote Althusser, so a practice of theory does exist. Theory is a specific practice, une pratique spécifique, which acts on its own object and ends in its own product, and product is a knowledge. Consider it in itself, any theoretical work presupposes a given raw material and some means of production. That means the concept of the theory and the way they are used, the method. The raw material worked by theoretical labor may be very ideological if the science is just coming into being. Very schematically, we may say that the means of theoretical labor, du travail théorique, which are an absolute conditions of its existence, theory and method, represent the active side of theoretical practice. Le côté actif de la pratique théorique, the determinant moment of the process. And what Althusser is talking about is different or asymmetrical to what Bourdieu calls la théorie de la pratique, theory of practice, or from what, par exemple, Jacques-Alain Miller is talking about in one of his seminars when he insists, I quote Miller, la pratique de la théorie, that means practice of theory, comme disait mon vieux maître Althusser, n'a pas sa place chez nous, chez Lacanien, does not exist for us. La seule théorie qui nous intéresse, c'est la théorie de la pratique. Theory of practice. As opposed to, for example, Bourdieu or Lacan or Lacanians, these examples are entirely arbitrary. Althusser insisted on Marx because Marx produces, I quote, une pratique théorique réelle, a real theoretical practice, and has no use of some kind, I quote Althusser, la théorie de sa propre pratique, de son processus. The theory capitalized of its own practice. Which is, after all, why this is Althusser, which is, after all, why he's writing Capital. And Althusser said, ce monumental work, monument, as Althusser puts it, and not some kind of dialectic. Although he does keep promising it, but whose writing he constantly puts off. It seems to me that this is how we should see, I think, or this is the only way to explain the power of the book Race, Nation, Class, which has brought us together after nearly 40 years. Balibar and Wallerstein produced, I quote, again Althusser, real theoretical practice. In chapter 10, Balibar explains how, in contrast, theory, for example, such as Marxism, he said, his formulation is form as theory, because Marxism is form as theory, or Hegelian system, as Engels insists, borrowing a sentence from Faust, is going towards its own destruction. Practice of theory is different from the best and only partially theoretical and disciplined project which determined the philosophy of former Yugoslavia, that means the Praxis school and its Praxis philosophy. This group of philosophers from Zagreb and Belgrade, and partly from Ljubljana always was on margins. This is in Ljubljana. You always can find some kind of hybrid between structuralism and praxis philosophy. They had a journal in Belgrade and Zagreb, Praxis, and summer school in Korčula, visited by Bloch, Marcuse, Habermas, but never Althusser, who was barred because, in his opinion of this philosopher, in the opinion of these philosophers, he was an ordinary Stalinist. Recently, for example, Honet told me how close Habermas and Gajo Petrović, who was the leader of this school, were very close, and many times together, drunk together, etc., etc. The group, first, this praxis group, criticized Tito's regime. Then they were pushed to the margins or expelled from the university. And the first director of the institute I am now the head of was Mihailo Marković, one of those expelled who founded the institute. Then this group to be returned to their university posts to later participate directly in political life and come to be in one way or another participants and responsible for dissolution of the country. Marković was the head of Milosevic's Socialist Party, but all these philosophers were politically engaged in Serbia, one becoming the president of the republic, others consultants, so various presidents, ministers, etc., etc. There were those who returned to Serbia after obtaining their PhDs abroad, such as Zoran Đinđić, assassinated 15 years ago, who studied with Habermas and Velma, who was briefly at the Institute for Philosophy before going into politics. I do not have a time to fully elaborate the dissolution of Yugoslavia in light of the breakup of this school of thought, the separation of Belgrade and Zagreb, and Ljubljana in one way, the fights about the founding of the journal Praxis International, edited by Marković and Richard Jacob Bernstein, older, that means from New School. As a guidance for this conversation, Manuela and Katrin raised the question, I quote, how can the intersection of theory and practice be made productive? End of quote. And this word, intersection, is actually found in the bodies of all these actors, quasi-theorists, who actively practice their own pseudo-theory, a theory that is practically an illusion, is not there, is latently not produced or practiced in Yugoslavia since its interception. They had great ideas, for example, ideas of self-management or common ownership or associative economy were never systematically constituted and sufficiently elaborated, just like an idea of new free university, not necessarily in the service of building reigning socialist structures. Praxis philosophy draws inspiration in the perhaps most mystical second thesis on Feuerbach. I will remind you this thesis, the question whether objective, I quote, the question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, i.e. the reality and power and this sidedness of this thinking in practice. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking that is isolated from practice is a purely scholastic question. Feuerbach, while practice is, for example, Gajo Petrović is designated as, I quote, Petrović, completely different than Althusser, completely different than Habermas, and different than Bourdieu. Free, universal, creative, self-creative activity with which man creates or acts or produces and alters or shapes his historical world and himself. An activity characteristic of man which differentiates him from all other beings. Practice designated in such illusionary fashion, imagined by most of these philosophers as revolutionary, implies only unreserved engagement, hysterical participation in government and opposition politics of Belgrade philosophers, always so close to power, and the slumber of praxis philosophy in the Zagreb during the 90s. I have done two things at this institute I had. I founded immediately the Group for Social Engagement Studies in order to halt this rush of tarnishing through action in the broadest sense of this word. And I have founded an award of the Institute that bears the name of only one of the praxis philosophers, the only one engaged against the wars in the region. His name is Miladin Životić. This year, the recipient of this award will be Judith Butler, and in the future, I hope, Axel and Etienne. Had Balibar and Wallerstein's seminar at the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris been conducted a little later, in all likelihood, their book would have been somewhat different. And I have already written the opposite. Had the seminars been held in Belgrade or in Zagreb, it is likely that the complicated construction known as Yugoslavia would have preserved some still sought after form within the framework of Europe. Yugoslavia fell apart or was wrought asunder by war in order for property to be reprivatized, to reconstitute private ownership. That's why was war. We have a regression from the dictatorship of the proletariat, the party, the dictatorship of party, and bureaucratic socialism back towards pluralism. Struggle for territory. Kosovo is at the beginning of all problems and remains so. Struggle for sovereignty was the transformation of one egalitarian, classless, and relatively uncorrupt society into current brutal criminal capitalism. The dissolution of Yugoslavia was above all the dissolution of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, losing power to various nationalist parties at the first pluralist elections in the new countries. Žižek also lost once because he was in election for the president in Ljubljana. Milosevic, it seems to me, was the only one not to lose elections due to an artificial rendering nationalist of his party's members. Religion and nationalism were only instruments or decoration. Here we could apply Balibar's implication of fictive ethnicity. Instrument for the mobilization of the masses, mobilization of the people or peoplehood in a struggle for territorial delimitation among the federal republics. It is followed by the problem of minorities, above all Serbs and Albanians, and small unlawful wars. Today, strong nationalist parties and in no way populist are in power. The 90s populism leads to war because Milosevic and the other party leaders took to the streets to tear down the constitution and laws of the Republic of Yugoslavia. This short introduction was supposed to follow some of Manuela's and Catherine's questions, answer them or negate them, that is, briefly thematize the destiny of a small, very small but very interesting country, at its beginnings truly interesting in its tackling of nationalism, religion, and Stalinism. It is enough to look at the first editions of L'État moderne, for example, and the origin of host of sovereign, small sovereign countries that now stand in its stead. I would like to thank you all again, above all Etienne, and give the floor to you, my friend.
Thank you. I want to pick up the discussion which I had left yesterday and blatantly want to use this opportunity to drive home certain points which I thought I had not been clear on, and the phrasing of the theme, where is the nation formed, social communities between religion, populism, and resistance. What I want to do in the next 10-15 minutes is to again revisit how the nation form is being renegotiated by those who make the nation. And in this, you might say the historical agenda, the contemporary historical agenda, how what we know as populism and what is used almost without any qualification to the extent that it loses its purchase. It is heaped on political movements and formations without almost any kind of qualification or care. But therefore, to see how certain popular movements, usually described as populism, becomes essential for the people to make their political presence felt, and which, of course, as I argue, takes the left off guard, because the left, at least in India and in many other post-colonial countries, were not used to the kind of change that is taking place in post-colonial politics. So in a sense, it therefore opens up the question of the people, the popular, the populist and populism, and whether there has been ever any democracy without the so-called populist element in it. Can we envisage, can we think of any democratic experience that did not have its requisite or required input of what we have come to know as populism? And you will see, therefore, how I, or not only I, but other scholars, those who study post-colonial democracy as closely as possible, diverge, therefore, enormously from Laclau's famous formulations on populist reason. One thing that is very clear as to what is happening in India, and I do not want to make it a kind of a factual report on what is happening, but which are pertinent nonetheless, is the kind of ways in which people are responding to the travails of globalization on the society. I mean, one has to understand that it is not merely a crisis of liberalism, but at least India and many other newly independent or decolonized countries had probably the good fortune of escaping a long liberal past where liberal parliamentary sovereignty would be kind of become part of flesh and blood of the people and polity. That did not happen to India, for good or bad. So therefore, we had a democratic setup which still continues, but which was based on certain, you might call, stable social formations. So the nation as a social community could not merely be imagined, but could be given its institutional forms because of what the Communist parties called the big landlord and the big bourgeois alliance, others called newly independent capitalist country. But by and large, we can say that classes were on the whole stable. And the economy also on the whole had a fairly understandable structure to it. But certainly from the late 80s and early 90s onwards, specifically after the current round of globalization, that you find 3-4 features that have made the country, in terms of its social formation, unstable. One is, of course, the advent or the emergence of the informal labor at a massive, massive scale, unimaginable. The scale into which the informal labor has become the predominant characteristic of the labor scenario. We also have the still unexplained, which I have tried to explain in a different context, the simultaneous presence of what you might call primitive accumulation and the domination of financial capital. So you can have on one hand not only special economic zones, but an area like the New Mumbai, which is becoming the center of housing the data centers from all around the world, including the big data centers of the US. And on the other hand, you have also the opening up of mines through sheer what Marx called, following Adam Smith, primitive accumulation. We also have a breakup of the old peasant economy. So the old peasant mode of production is by and large over. Villages are almost tied up with urban economy, which is not necessarily an industrial economy. And all this is marked or crisscrossed by the phenomenon of migration. To give you only one simple instance which will, convey an idea of the scale that I am suggesting, thousands and thousands of people from northeast or Bengal or Bihar, that's the eastern and the northeastern part of the country, are like the roving bands of the tribal peasantry of the late 19th century, travel to Gujarat, Mumbai, and Kerala, where the wages are high, in massive numbers. They stay there. Government is trying in the name of financial inclusion to document their movements, give them, you heard of the Aadhaar card, give them some kind of access to banks, but by and large, through the old modes of money transmission, the families in the villages continue, and the migrant laborers actually are the backbone of the new economies of the thriving India, which is having 7% growth rate on the whole continuously. So, above all, you have also the small towns, which are classified as small towns and census towns by the Census of India, which classifies any town with less than 10,000 population as being census town, and then you have up to 50,000 small towns, where issues of what one labor historian has called from plow to pick, so the plow of the peasant to the pick of the digger and the laborer, construction labor, range of forms of labor forms remain. And I just tell you all these things to give you an idea of who are the carriers of the today's anti-globalization, populist movement, populist rhetoric, populist ideas. They are not necessarily right-wing. They support and they demand, measures from the government. They support political movements that will give them even a quarter of the demands that they have. And therefore, on the whole, what is happening, and which I wanted to, give an idea yesterday, but I felt later that I was unable to do so, is that this gives then certain political movements based a section of the lumpen proletariat, which we used to call in the old language, but certainly this massive number of range of fragmented, unorganized labor class, the social basis on which the populist movements today stand. They have relation and similarities with many right-wing populist movements, like individual-centric, less a party, more than a rabble-rousing band or a wagon of people who want to get on board. But on the other hand, they are also, they form a movement which tries to redefine what the Indian nation is, redefining the heritage of 19th century tolerance and ecumenism, redefining the whole question of what should be government welfare, and what we usually term as welfare is something that is now retranslated in the language of rights, and probably Amartya Sen would have called entitlement. Interesting is also that these are precisely the states and the emerging political communities led by these kinds of movements, which not only try to redefine and reimagine the desired nation, what an India should be, opposes the state, but also it is much more hospitable to refugees and migrants. And this is again in conformity with, in general, you might say, historical experiences of extending hospitality to alien groups, where generally you find within the people a much more democratic urge of expanding the base of political participation and new entrants in politics. To give you again a very rough idea of the kind of welfares, therefore, that are introduced by populist governments, in many ways similar to probably Venezuela, I had written on the similarity between the two, is that first of all, women, girl children, female students, they become the first major object of so-called governmental welfare programs, where enormous innovations are being done in the sense of, if you do not marry off your girl before the age of 18, you get so much money. If you can help your child to pass graduation, you get so much amount of money. If you spend less amount on your marriage, then you get, these are the government facilities to certain things that have happened today, which were unprecedented if you think of India as the situation where each and every girl child, and not only girl child, will get a pair of shoes in order to go to the schools. They didn't have any shoes, they used to go barefoot, and you will get a cycle. And these are now major programs on which the right-wing newspapers are obviously claiming that these are vote-fetching programs, as if others were not concerned about vote. There is also something which is, apart from women, how are the peasants being targeted? Because India in the last decade has been infamous for farmer suicides. On an average, per year, it is now being calculated that 8,000 to 10,000 farmers commit suicide because of the whole crash of the agrarian market, the drop in the support prices of Indian agriculture, and in the name of the neoliberal pressure on the union government, there is this whole idea that any kind of subsidy should be stopped. So again, one of the, it's in many ways will remind you of the agrarian populism of the 19th century, and it is in many ways agrarian populism, but as I explained, that you can no longer classify it as agrarian or urban, because there's a much more of a continuum that is emerging in the wake of the neoliberal reforms, where you find the fair price shops in small towns, minimum support for agricultural products, and what are called peasant markets or marts. They are coming up to the extent that in certain distressed areas, these populist governments are now extending, measures that were probably 2 penny or 3 penny would be 1 kg of rice. And considering India, you have to understand why this is important. It's failing also. It's failing in terms of helping the workers in raising their wages. It is also failing in terms of averting the lockouts and the closures of factories, etc. So what I am trying to say, and I will now wind up, but I hope that there is time for discussion. If you ask me what are the economic possibilities of such kind of populism, I will say limited. But on the other hand, what are the political possibilities? The political possibilities of such kind of populism, I would say enormous. And one thing that is extremely interesting and which is unlike the Latin American experience is the way in which populist movements and populist governments, not the central government, I am speaking of state government and political movements, have been able to innovate and able to conjure up in some sense newer and newer kinds of these kinds of governmental reform programs, which are then linked with the whole question of how do you imagine your own nation? If this India is yours, then what is the India that you want, and how do you claim it from the other groups of people who will think that India is there? So are we therefore experiencing a recomposition of what we call as people? I think that we are, experiencing such a recomposition. I mean, if you think of Gramsci's idea of national popular, where Gramsci opened up the question of nation with the interrogating, axis of interrogating question around people, or the other way around, the one thing that he could not probably have seen at that time, but which is very clear in the deep examination of a possible examination of the question of national popular, is that do we have recompositions of the nations, or do we think it is over as a social community? And therefore, in the recomposing of the nation, how do people recompose themselves? And therefore, in that light, I think the old debates and the old formulations of populism are, for most of the part, they have to be thrown by the wayside. And I do not want to be very, critical about Laclau's formulation. Only thing is that they do not take into account the experiences of popular struggles. So to the question, what happens then to class? What happens then to resistance? Or to the question of resistance, precisely these are the new ways, partly shaped by governmental apparatus, but partly also shaped by the response of the poor people, the response of the informal laborers, and the lowest section of the peasantry, particularly the migrants of the small towns, that it is reshaping how resistance, at least at the initial level, would be. And on the other hand, what happens to class? Class politics precisely is mediated through these. So it's not over, but simply forms a changing. Thank you.
Before finding my own voice, I would like to address two questions to my panel friends. One is to you, Petar, because the two models, Yugoslavia and India, presented, in my eyes, pluralism, and both failed today. But in the case of Yugoslavia, I would like to come to Bosnian Muslims, because the moment after the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the civil war, the whole issue of European Muslims the Bosnians were distanced from Europe in a way. I gave this analogy between the destruction of the Mostar Bridge and the destruction of the Berlin Wall. We all focused on the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was very important, but we have totally dismissed the destruction of the Mostar bridge, which really united different parts, and this Mostar Bridge, which was, besides created by Ottoman architects, stood for some kind of patrimony, what was very important, and bridge as a signal, as a symbol of bridging differences and different ethnicities. So that analogy for me was important, because the fall of Berlin Wall meant something over, the unification, but already communism was over, whereas the destruction of the Mostar Bridge meant the Muslims living in Europe becoming the future problem. So for me, Yugoslavia is that moment of dissolution meant also all these problems. So in the second round, you can answer. And to you, I would like, suddenly I started playing the moderator role, but I think I'm in the middle. To you, you haven't, for us, Indian secularism was the model of pluralistic secularism, not national secularism. The example that really brought Muslims and Indians into a cohabitation. That is the model, which is very different from the Turkish secularism, which was much more related with nationhood and uniformization of society. So you haven't mentioned how populism today is also related with the emergence of Hindu nationalism and having a very important impact on this pluralistic notion of secularism in India. So there's also a failure, in my eyes, with this populism, failure of secularism as a pluralistic model. So now I want to move to my own words. I'll be a bit frustrated because I won't take what the thread from yesterday's talk on European Muslims, but shift, as people asked me, the organizers, to the nation form and especially the rise of these populist movements. And I will speak with the Turkish model today, Turkish experience in mind. So the first issue, because in this morning we were also trying to name these new populist movements, how we name them. This is part of the, I think, practice of theory. How when there's something new, we search for concepts. Of course, we take it from the past. Very often I heard the word fascism, but is really fascism is enough to understand these movements? Some people say they are illiberal democracies because still there is something about democracy, but values of liberalism, political liberalism are not cherished. Some people would speak more about the coming back of this strong leadership and masculine values. With that therefore authoritarian personality, authoritarianism coming back, and especially maybe new ways of articulating nationalism, nativism, and racism is taking place, and also with religion coming into that picture as well. I don't know if I would use Islamo-populist for the Turkish case. What is the nationalist dimension? What is the religious dimension? It's not easy to name it, but at least I would like to bring forth that the naming shouldn't be that automatical, because we are really observing a phenomena which is, we try to call neo-populist, but then the Latin American experience is different. We have to readjust these terms to the, in today's present situation. So some of the features, one thing is, before we used to think Western European democracies and the East as under military rule, decolonization processes, transition to democracy, always in terms of deficiency in relation to democracy, and the center being Europe's democracy. Today that's over, because both Europe and the non-Western are entering into that phase. We don't know how long it will take. Is this a backlash, or is there something really more important that will settle? But the East and the West lost its distinctive, I would say, temporalities and political systems. We can't speak about the Western countries are also endangered by this emergence of populist countries, and not only Eastern Europe, but Western Europe and the United States. I'm not going to go into details between Orban in Hungary, in Austria, but also in Poland, and then Turkey, and United States, India, and China also becoming again on the picture once again. So although these are very different, there's something happening at the level of the world system. So going back to Immanuel Wallerstein's observation, he said, we are moving from a center-periphery kind of division to a world system which is multi-centered. What is the consequence of that on this new populist movements? I would say, because these new countries, especially the non-Western, because India, Turkey, and others, there's a claim to be players, global players, regional players. And I think this is very important. This is the multi-centered thing. They claim to be players in the region and at the global level, and sometimes beyond the frontiers, beyond their national frontiers. And I think in the talk of Etienne Balibar, there was a very important intuition. He spoke about population control of these new powers, that is, demographic becoming very important. And I thought of new wars. The Syrian example, the Syria war in Syria is a very good example. So all these forces are trying to control Syria, Turkey, Russia, Iran, and other forces. And so therefore it is beyond the frontiers, national frontiers. But this war maybe is not only about the question of minorities, Kurds, and or the Daesh, ISIS movement, but it's also maybe something about the population control related more with capitalism. And the Turkish case, we shouldn't forget about the refugees, Syrian refugees, 3.5 million refugees changing. So the population, politics of population will be more and more important, not only an issue of immigration, but issue of economics. So this is one thing I think that we shouldn't forget maybe about these new populist movements. The nationhood is changing, the national frontiers are changing. In the mass media, we'll read a lot about these fantasies about the empire, Tsar, and the Sultan, that is the Russian Putin, and about Erdogan. But there is something maybe more foundational in terms of reimagining the frontiers in relation to population controls that can bring something beyond the national nationhood for these powers. That's, I think, one hypothesis that I will dare to make, that there is something changing with these nationalist populist movements. Third is modes of governance, and you mentioned them so well, because we shouldn't think of these populist movements as incapable of governing, but a kind of mode of governance that we should understand maybe in different terms. One thing I will bring is mega projects, and there is this obsession with mega projects. That's very, that is something maybe we will not pay attention when we study populist movements in Europe. But when we study populist movements in non-Western contexts, in in Asia, in Turkey, in other parts, mega projects plays a very important role. So the question of resistance, I will come back at the end of my little intervention, will be very much related with these mega projects. And these mega projects are maybe also important to understand, very close to what you have said, including new populations. In the case of Erdogan, there was a lot of infrastructure for public transport and housing. And this meant the periphery coming to the center of the cities much more easily. And therefore, again, it's very much related with labor force, but also inclusion of this labor force into the cities. So this infrastructure was both inward-looking, but also outside-looking, now constructing the biggest airport in Turkey and changing the Istanbul Canal and so on. I thought about making a kind of reflection in the past. Remembered the book written by, I think, German professor Karl Schlogel, historian, and Moscow 1937. Moscow 1937 is very interesting because there's a lot of mega projects going on. It is not independent. Stalin period is not independent of these unbelievable mega projects in Moscow, transformation of the whole city and the country as well. So this short trials, all these trials that are fake trials, fake news, whatever you want, politics of elimination, death, necropolitics, let's say, they go hand in hand with these mega projects. So I think we should really be more attentive to these modes of governance. And now, in terms of the leadership, politics, you have this. Politics is this going back to strong leadership. We had that in the morning session. It's a kind of end of the cultural atmosphere. Our friends spoke about atmosphere or cultural climate coming from '68, that we all celebrated rights of minorities, pluralism, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, everything that questioned the hegemony of the nationalist narrative. It's almost like a reaction to that. Now we are no more on the minority making, but majority making. And I would really speak about this majority making. It's not only about the election, the numbers of majority, but the construction of a majority. What is majority? So all these movements of populism are trying to bring the idea of majority, both in terms of numbers. That's why they try to justify themselves by elections. That's the democratic thing, and very secular, because they are not justifying themselves by the transcendental powers, but by popular sovereignty. So now the idea of people, I think, is at the heart. You mentioned it. The idea of people is at the heart of this contestation, because it is the extraction of people from the people. Because who is the people? Like the real Americans, who is the people? So the extraction of the people, so this majority in the making is the most oppressive element, because you have to find enemies to exclude in order to affirm the presence, the majority rights. And I think here comes the articulation of the narrative on what is nationalism, religion, and therefore, and in that sense, maybe ethno-racist definition of peoplehood is very important. If we think of nationalism more in universal terms, or nationalism more ethnicist, racist terms, and the two, they go together. When you read the chapter on nationalism and racism in Balibar, I think it's a very good pathway to understand it. And in the case of Turkey, we hear the definition of this new citizenship between praying and a flag. All right? So you have to have this ideal citizenship, how you define a citizen in conformity with these norms. So this is the majority making, means you have to come up with some norms also in the public life. And it's based upon the exclusion of the others. Who are the others? Who are the others? Is it the minorities or those? And I think it is very important to understand the social relationship between the public, the majority making, and those who are targeted as not making part of the body of this nationhood and people. And they are basically not only ethnic others, like Kurds or other religious minorities, they can be Muslims who are different, have different interpretations than the ones who will be imposed by the state. So there is this tendency in all populist movements to bring homogeneity, to uniformize by bringing nationalism into that, and nationalize Islam as well. So that's why it started. There's a big fight between AKP government and other Islamist movement, which is Gülenist. So what is the interpretation of religion? Religion normally was in the hands of the society. So now when it is taken by the state, it changes totally its articulation to power and definition. Secondly, they are targeting cultural elites, journalists, and public intellectuals. Same in India. So I think this is a very important part. I will say it relates us with cosmopolitics. That is, all those who have relations with other countries because of their work, who are in networking. It doesn't mean they're elites, but they can be artists, they can be academicians, journalists, not only nativists. And this is a very, I would say, important element of frontiers, how you put frontiers, and therefore have a suspicion of all the others, like Jews in the past, belonging to several cultural and national belongings. By the way, just to shift our gaze, in Europe, the double citizenship is becoming also a problem. You remember, it became again an issue of taking back double citizenship. So I think in the future this will be more and more a problem. If you can belong to several nations, if you can have several passports or not. I will finish in relation to what is the horizon in that kind of the leadership who also destroys all the representative institutions of politics, because the leader should be the embodiment of the people and no need for any intermediate associations. I think this is a very important feature of populist movements, because although they do speak about elections, there is no check and balances, no more intermediate associative life and representation which is valued. I will come for what is the alternative to that, what kind of resistance we can think about it. I'll come to the movements of public space, that is Gezi movement in Turkey, but also Tahrir movement in Egypt, which gave rise to Arab Spring, and then it failed, and then we can think that politically these movements were not sustainable, they didn't have an impact, but I believe that they opened up a horizon of the possible that we intellectuals should develop as praxis of theory more and more. Why? Because in those movements, it is true, it is not like a political organization, it's not a party movement, so it doesn't fit into the framework of the leftist movements from the past, but all the singularities expressed on the public square. On the public square, singularities, I'm saying, because people came with their differences. LGBTI movement, but also football supporters were there. So both very different kind of language. They had to adapt the language. Feminists were correcting the language of the football supporters. And the management of violence, I'm speaking about the Gezi protest movements. And so there were Turkish, what we call white Turks, coming from the upper class, secular, westernized young people who were for the first time maybe understanding, creating empathy with the language of Kurdish, trying to establish relationship with the east of Turkey and with Kurds. And also never those secularists who have never been with Muslims, they were protesting, they were living, they were habitating the Gezi, the public square, with some Muslims called anti-capitalist Muslims. So we have different actors, because public square reveals the movement's identity. It's not an identity movement. Space brings it together. That also brings me into the idea of Negri about common, how we create a common. We only can create a common, something common in the public square. So I finished saying that public square itself became a very important enjeu, stake for our democracies. We have to take it back. We have to reappropriate it. It's more than freedom of expression. It's also freedom of appropriating it, habitation of the public space. Either it is confiscated by the private capital, it is privatized, or by authoritarian populist regimes who doesn't give any possibility for the contestation of norms, including, in the European case, to relate it with yesterday's talk. Because if the norms are just to be, not to be questioned and elaborated, then there's no place for public space. Public space is the place where we encounter and try to get familiarized with one other's perspective and point of view and difference. Thank you.
Okay, Nilüfer, we have not, I think, sorry, we have not the time for seconds.
Okay.
But for you, yes. Please.
I see what you mean.
Question. Hello. Yeah, it's a question for all three of you, but it's really inspired by the last talk. So, what is the role of the intellectual in this kind of radical publicness? Given also that you speak in Haus der Kultur und der Welt, is it like, do you embrace such kind of protest action? Do you teach outside? Do you do public sociology, public anthropology? Like, how do you see your role in this? Like, do you project something into the future that is different in your own practice, how you produce knowledge?
What we do, we
culminate. Yeah, that would be saving time.
We group. Then I use time. Thank you. Well, this is quite a difficult question. First, when Gezi happened, I had the feeling, I have written a series of articles on internet, anatomy of the Gezi movement, and then media came to me to comment on the Gezi, and I said, no way, I shouldn't. I had that feeling that intellectuals shouldn't be the spokespersons of this movement. So that's something very important. I wrote it discreetly, but I really cared not to become a sort of spokesperson, because one of the features of these movements, they don't want leadership. They are not in this verticality, what we call horizontality, and they don't want spokespersons. So it's not theory by those intellectuals and themselves who are just actors. They are also making sense and narrative of their own movements. So the way we situate ourselves as intellectuals is then what we do in the, well, you can go and be part of them, all right, but then I think it's very important for us to continue to give importance to these movements, whereas they were despised, penalized by the political powers, suppressed, and also by by the intellectuals themselves. They were said, no effect, it all disappeared. So remembering and working on this movement, making it alive today is my first, in my case, my first public engagement with these movements. So I tried to make the archives of this movement. It's like for the Tiananmen, maybe you should, it is, I came across that with Agamben. I was looking for Tiananmen because each time I was working on these Maidan movements, I call them Maidan, and Maidan means public square, and it is Persian origin and Turkish Ottoman heritage in Ukraine that brought this notion into our circulation. It is Maidan and public square, they are the same. So these Maidan movements, it's important always to change our gaze and language from Eurocentrism to other parts of the world. I said we have to pay a tribute to Tiananmen, because maybe we have to understand Tiananmen as a public square movement as well, and not just criticism of the political power. Because when you come together, it's not like manifestation. It is like coming together, you look to each other, you have to perform, you have to exchange, you habit that place. And they have transformed that place into library, into ways of performative action. Art played a very important role. Artistic expressions, irony became a very important. The reversal of the stigmat was very important because the power never acknowledged the agency of these people, saying that these are like çapulcu, slum, scums, and very bad terms. Like racaille in France also, that is, you are not an actor, you are not a respectful, you don't have a respectful agency, so you are treated. And then they turn that name, that label, to the hashtag of the movement. I am all çapulcu. I am a çapulcu, and many people from outside, they have taken this also. So this became almost a global movement, so the reversal of the çapulcu. But this is not an identity movement. This was really very important, how people encountered differences and tried to find a commonality. Just one moment I take from Egypt. In Egypt, there's a case of a Copt young woman who came to Tahrir Square the first. She said about the same kind of story, saying that the first time I went out of my neighborhood, Christian Copt, and I met during the Tahrir Square that I made part of others. And this was a very important, she's a filmmaker, she's an artist. So I think that element of encounter and making something common is very important.
I have one short response to your question and the one that was raised. You see, on the question of secularism that you mentioned, on the whole anti-globalization and pro-poor, these kinds of populist movements, which, as I said, remind us of the agrarian populism of the 19th century, they are redefining secularism. The secularism that we had was out and out a liberal ideology. It was state secularism, and it had, on one hand, it was patronizing the majority religion, and on the other hand, what it was doing to the minorities was allowing the minority existence only in the ghettoized form. You see, you understand what I mean. On the other hand, you will note that I was using the word ecumenical, precisely because there is a shift from secularism to what you might call tolerance. It's not the Lockean toleration, but the idea that there are many religions which you have to tolerate, and the religions have to enter into dialogues with each other, and the state should provide either the canopy or the sitting house, sitting chamber, where the religious dialogues can take place, and that's the role of the state. The usual idea of secularism doesn't tell us that. So, and the contours of redefining what is secularism they are not as yet clear, but I'm sure that in the kind of social experiment that are being undertaken by these governments of the poor, which are, as I said, informal, producer-based, informal labor-based. So we are seeing that, so the whole question of secularism will have to be thought again. On the question of intellectual, I have a different answer. Again, based on and which I'm quite sure you would not like, which is that we have to understand why these governments of the poor are so anti-intellectual. The whole question of the position of the intellectuals as kind of mentors of society is something that we have inherited from the liberal rule. This is overvalued. Let's face it. Think of Gramsci, who was writing in his own understanding of passive revolution, and Gramsci said and didn't explain, but it was one of his most understated, fascinating remarks, that during the restructuring of society along the lines of passive revolution, Gramsci writes, intellectuals become spokesperson of rule. It becomes so. On the other hand, Gramsci said that if you have to be an intellectual, be an organic intellectual. We all have debates around what it means. But clearly, the role of public intellectual, this is overvalorized. And there is no reason I see why what we usually am calling of the populist movements, which really show no sympathy for this exalted role of the intellectuals in society, and apparently becoming the guardians of our conscience, of our intellect, of our upbringing. If that comes to end, let's admit that the kind of populist rules that are there, there will not be much role of quote and unquote the intellectuals. So you will have education, you will have colleges, schools, teachers, painters, everything. But this whole nomenclature called the intellectual might not have that prestige. Which brings me actually to the last point in reference to that, and which you mentioned very rightly. Why is it that populist governments, particularly the kind of left-wing populist government or anti-globalization, pro-poor populist governments that you find in Latin America, that you find in many states in India now, why are they so, as you said, big project-centric? But interestingly, they are also very keen on building up social infrastructure. And in the infrastructure, or in the terms of building up the logistical framework of a society, something that is, again, strikes your mind is the kind of new primary schools that are opened. Universities are open. At once, the educated middle classes pounce upon the government, oh, they have not, given this, they have not built up a proper university, there is hardly a building, they're giving a name to that. In the university ranking, including Shanghai ranking, India stands one of the lowest. We are caught by this whole liberal notion of certain things which we call by education. And the moment you see that a poor persons or poor classes or these kinds of government by the underclasses, they take then the seat of power, they don't want, they're not doing any revolutionary thing. But clearly the style, the mode, as you said, the mode of governing is such that which makes it at odd and a complete kind of opposition to the given liberal experiences of rule, where excellence, meritocracy, intellectual, guardianship of society, all these are then put to question. And if they're put to question, I have no hesitation in admitting so much good for us. At least we should have been in for such kind of experiences for a long time, and that if it is happening, let it happen.
Okay, I can say just that I mentioned in the text, I think that it's most important to reconstruct the collective engagement, group engagement, to learn again what does it mean to work together, what is cooperation, coordination, and if you want to replace this scene, because to understand that this scene is constructed with, for example, this book, then this work, and to replace this in our institutions, in our group, and try to do something together. Because in history, intellectual history, in the last, 70 years, you have individual engagement in Sartre, in Foucault also. Not critical engagement, not collective engagement. That is most important.